They called it a monster. Too heavy, too slow, too ugly to ever win a fight. When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first took to the skies, even its own pilots didn't believe in it. It looked like a flying oil drum, massive, over-engineered, an insult to the sleek fighters of the time. In a war obsessed with speed and agility, the Thunderbolt was a brute that seemed out of place. But in the end, that brute would save Europe. Because while others danced through the clouds, the P-47 would crash through them, guns blazing, unshaken by flak or fire. It didn't need elegance, it needed endurance. This is the story of the plane that went from being a joke to a juggernaut. The story of how American industry, sheer stubborn engineering, and the courage of its pilots turned ridicule into reverence. By 1943, the war had reached a breaking point. Britain still stood defiant, but Nazi Germany ruled the skies over occupied Europe. American bombers, B-17s and B-24s were being shredded by German fighters long before they reached their targets. Escort fighters simply couldn't go the distance. Every mission meant death. And yet, across the Atlantic, in a factory in Farmingdale, New York, an immigrant engineer named Alexander Kartveli believed he could build something different, something that could survive. Kartveli wasn't chasing beauty, he was chasing power. His idea was simple, even crude. Take the biggest, most powerful piston engine in the world, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, and build a fighter around it. Not for elegance, for survival. It would have a bubble canopy, 8.5 cal machine guns, and the kind of armor that could shrug off hits that would tear other planes apart. It would climb high, fly fast, and still take punishment on the way down. Republic aviation engineers called it Project AP-10A at first, then XP-47B. The prototype looked like nothing else in the air. Swollen fuselage, wide wings, and a roar that could be heard long after it passed overhead. The pilots laughed, so did the press. Too big, they said. Too heavy. Too American. But inside that aluminum shell was raw potential, a promise forged in steel and oil. Because while the early models were flawed and temperamental, one thing became clear fast: nothing could kill it. Even when riddled with bullets, it limped home. When engines failed, it glided farther than it had any right to. Pilots started calling it the Jug. At first, as an insult, juggernaut. But soon, as a badge of honor. This is the journey of that Jug. From the drawing board of a stubborn engineer to the skies over Normandy, where it became the hammer that broke the German war machine. It is a story of engineering genius, industrial might, and the human spirit that refused to quit. And sometimes they change everything. By 1940, the world was burning. France had fallen, Britain was bleeding, and the United States, though not yet in the fight, could feel the heat of a war that was spreading like wildfire. In the factories of Long Island, engineers worked sleepless nights, racing against a clock that was ticking toward catastrophe. At the center of it all stood Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant who had fled the Soviet Revolution decades earlier. To him, America wasn't just a new home. It was a blank page, a place where an engineer's dream could become an engine of survival. Kartveli was brilliant, stubborn, and obsessed with one thing: building aircraft that could take punishment and still come home. He'd seen too many pilots die because their planes were built for beauty, not for battle. So when the U.S. Army Air Corps approached Republic Aviation with a simple but desperate demand, "Build us a fighter that can escort our bombers deep into enemy territory," Kartveli didn't hesitate. He went back to his drawing board and started with the heart. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a monster of an engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower. It was an air-cooled radial engine, wide and round, the kind of power plant that looked more like a factory machine than an airplane motor. But it could take damage and keep running. Most designers would have wrapped that engine in a slender, elegant frame. Kartveli didn't care about elegance. He built the P-47 around the engine, literally. Every curve, every bolt, every joint was dictated by function. The result? A fuselage the size of a small car. A cockpit that sat high, giving pilots visibility over those wide elliptical wings. And a weight, fully loaded, of nearly 8 tons. To put it simply, it was absurd. Even some within Republic Aviation thought Kartveli had lost his mind. They said, "It's too big to dogfight. It'll never get off the ground." But Kartveli wasn't building a ballet dancer. He was building a sledgehammer. The prototype, the XP-47B, rolled out of the hangar on May 6, 1941. It was loud, ungainly, and unlike anything the Air Corps had ever seen. When the test pilot, Lowell Smith, climbed into the cockpit, even he was skeptical. But when that engine roared to life and the plane lifted off, something remarkable happened. It climbed. Fast. It didn't flutter or stall. It just went. The Air Corps officers watching below exchanged glances, disbelief, then a slow grin. Because despite its size, the XP-47B hit over 400 miles per hour, faster than almost anything the U.S. had in service. It was heavy, yes, but it was also stable, deadly, and unstoppable in a dive. Still, it wasn't perfect. Early tests showed serious flaws. The cockpit filled with fumes, the guns jammed, and its range was abysmal. But Kartveli and his team fixed them, one by one. They redesigned the turbocharger system, improved fuel capacity, and reinforced the wings to carry bombs and rockets. And just as the P-47 was getting ready for production, the world shifted. The United States was now at war. Overnight, America's industrial heart ignited. Car factories turned into airplane assembly lines. Women stepped into workshops. Millions worked around the clock. And in Farmingdale, the Republic factory roared to life like a living machine. P-47s rolled out in dozens, then hundreds. The machine that had once been doubted was now being mass-produced at a scale the world had never seen. But there was a problem. The war in Europe wasn't waiting. American bomber crews were dying over the skies of Germany. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, dominated the air. Their fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, were fast, agile, and lethal. The bombers, heavy, slow, and unescorted, were easy prey. For all its power, the turbojug had one critical flaw. It was a short-range giant in a long-range war. So once again, Kartveli went back to work. He redesigned the wings to carry drop tanks, external fuel pods that could be jettisoned in flight. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Slowly, the range problem faded. Now the Jug could go the distance. And once it did, the skies over Europe would never be the same. By mid-1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had arrived in full force. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolf Pack, took them into combat for the first time. What they discovered was staggering. The Jug could dive faster than any German fighter. It could absorb hits that would shatter a Messerschmitt. Pilots began to trust it, even love it. When they came home riddled with bullet holes, oil leaking, wings torn, they realized something profound. The Jug could take it. And that's when the legend began. The ugly duckling had become the war's most dependable beast, a flying tank that could escort, fight, and destroy. But what no one knew yet was that the Jug was only getting started, because soon its mission would change. It wouldn't just protect bombers. It would descend from the clouds and become a weapon of total destruction. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had changed. American bombers were pushing deeper into German territory. The Luftwaffe, once invincible, was bleeding. But the skies were still deadly, and the ground below was even worse. Every field, every bridge, every railway in occupied Europe pulsed with German armor and artillery, the veins of Hitler's war machine. To win the war, the Allies couldn't just bomb cities, they had to choke those veins. And that's where the P-47 Thunderbolt was about to earn its reputation as one of the most feared aircraft of the Second World War. At first, the P-47's mission was simple: escort the bombers, keep them alive. But soon, the U.S. Army Air Forces realized something. The Jug could carry bombs, a lot of them. With its rugged frame and massive wings, it could haul 2,500 pounds of ordnance, bombs, rockets, even napalm canisters. While the British Spitfire danced gracefully through the air, the Jug roared down like a steel hammer. It became the perfect fighter bomber. Its new mission was brutal: to dive from the clouds and annihilate anything that moved. Tanks, trains, convoys, even columns of fleeing troops. Pilots called it the Jug Dive. From 15,000 feet, they'd nose down at terrifying speeds, aiming at a single bridge or tank. The airframe shook, the wings groaned, and the altimeter spun like mad. But the P-47 held steady. And when they pulled the trigger, the sound was deafening. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns unleashed over 13 pounds of lead every second. It wasn't just an attack, it was a storm. A torrent of bullets that could slice through trucks, split trains in half, and turn tanks into twisted wrecks. German soldiers began to recognize that sound. They called it their Schwarze Tod, the Black Death. One Luftwaffe officer later recalled, "You'd hear the engines before you saw them, and by the time you looked up, it was too late." The Jug wasn't precise, it wasn't elegant, but it didn't need to be. It was devastating, and it was everywhere. When the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the P-47 was there, screaming over the beaches. As the troops pushed inland, the Thunderbolts became their angels, circling overhead, answering desperate radio calls from soldiers pinned down by German armor. Tank columns that once rolled confidently through France began to vanish overnight. Bridges exploded, supply lines burned, and trains were torn apart before they even reached the front. For the Germans, it felt like the sky itself had turned hostile. The secret wasn't just the firepower, it was durability. P-47s flew so low during attack runs that their bellies were often scorched by their own explosions. They came back riddled with holes, engines sputtering, sometimes missing entire control surfaces, and still landed safely. One pilot, Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, was hit by flak so severe his entire wingtip was blown off, and yet he made it home. Another, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, survived 21 hits from a Focke-Wulf 190, his canopy jammed, his radio dead, and he still flew back across the channel. That was the Thunderbolt. It didn't break. It endured. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was collapsing. Its once proud aces were gone. Its fuel reserves were empty. And over every road and rail in Western Europe, the Jug ruled supreme. In some regions, P-47 pilots became as feared as the Tiger tanks they destroyed. They hunted in pairs or groups of 4, swooping down without warning, striking, then vanishing back into the clouds. This wasn't just a war of machines anymore. It was personal. The pilots of the 9th Air Forces, flying Jugs out of hastily built airstrips in France, described it as the most satisfying work of the war. Not because it was easy, but because they could see the results. A destroyed train meant no reinforcements. A wrecked bridge meant no retreat. Every mission crippled the Reich a little more. But the cost was real. Ground attack missions were deadly. Flak guns lined every road, every tree line. The German 88 could tear a Thunderbolt apart in seconds. Pilots had to fly through walls of steel, often without escorts, often without warning. Many never made it home. But those who did carried stories that sounded almost mythical, of limping across the channel with oil pouring from their engines, of landing on one wheel, of surviving explosions that should have killed them. And for every Jug that fell, another was waiting, rebuilt, rearmed, and ready to return. By the winter of 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had transformed from an underdog to a legend. It wasn't just protecting bombers anymore. It was shaping the outcome of the war itself. And as the Allied armies closed in on Germany, the Jug became a symbol of power, of endurance, of an industrial force that refused to break. But while Europe burned, another storm was brewing thousands of miles away, across the Pacific, and soon the Jug would have one last act to play against a new kind of enemy. By 1944, Europe was being torn apart piece by piece. The German war machine was faltering. The Luftwaffe, once feared, once untouchable, was dying in the air. But on the other side of the world, Another empire was still fighting, and fighting hard. The Pacific was a different kind of war. It wasn't fought over cities or railways, but across endless stretches of ocean, coral islands, and jungles. Here, the enemy wasn't the Luftwaffe, it was the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, and they fought with a very different kind of ferocity. And the aircraft that dominated those skies were different too. Nimble, lightweight machines like the Mitsubishi A6M0, designed for speed and agility, not endurance. The US needed something that could hit hard, survive the elements, and strike deep across islands separated by hundreds of miles of water. That was a perfect mission for a familiar beast, the P-47 Thunderbolt. In 1944, the first Thunderbolts arrived in the Pacific Theater. They looked strange next to the lean, long-range P-38 Lightnings and sleek P-51 Mustangs already in service. But when the pilots took them up, the old legend came alive again. The Pacific Islands were brutal on machines. Heat warped engines, sand chewed through propellers, salt air corroded everything. But the Jug didn't care. Its air-cooled engine, the same monstrous R-2800 that had carried it across Europe, meant it didn't need delicate radiator systems like the Mustangs or Lightnings. Where others overheated, the Jug just kept roaring. In the jungles of New Guinea, the Philippines, and Burma, the Thunderbolt became the soldier's guardian angel. It strafed enemy columns hidden under the canopy. It shredded anti-aircraft positions before amphibious landings. It destroyed enemy ships hiding in coves or hugging the coastline. And it could take hits that would have turned any other plane into smoke. One pilot, Colonel Neil Kirby, flew his P-47, nicknamed Fiery Ginger 4, into the record books with 22 aerial victories in the Pacific, earning the Medal of Honor. His secret? Dive, strike, and survive. Because even over the Pacific, the Jug remained the same. Fast in a dive, deadly at low altitude, and nearly indestructible. As the Allies closed in on Japan, the P-47 found itself on the front lines again, flying from captured islands, bombing shipping convoys, and tearing up airfields that would soon host B-29 bombers. By 1945, the Jug had earned a new nickname among its pilots, the Jug that wouldn't die. Even as the P-51 Mustang began to dominate the headlines, escorting bombers all the way to Tokyo, the P-47 quietly remained indispensable. It didn't have the glamour, but it had the grit. It was the hammer to the Mustang's scalpel. And then, in August 1945, the war ended. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought an unthinkable silence to the Pacific. The engines stopped. The skies went quiet. For the men who had flown the Jug, that silence was bittersweet. Many had grown attached to the machine that had carried them through fire and flak. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't pretty. But it had never let them down. When peace returned, the P-47 faded from the headlines almost overnight. The newer jets, the P-80 Shooting Star and the F-86 Sabre, stole the stage. The age of propellers was over, but the Jug refused to vanish completely. Thousands were sent to foreign air forces, France, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, and Yugoslavia, where they kept flying well into the 1950s. In the jungles of South America, a few jugs even saw combat again, long after World War II was over. For some, it became a workhorse of peace, dropping supplies instead of bombs, mapping terrain instead of destroying it. But no matter where it flew, the legend followed. Because for every pilot who sat behind that heavy control stick, who felt that engine's vibration through the seat, who looked through the gun sight at the horizon, the jug was more than metal. It was a promise that no matter how bad it got, they could make it home. The Thunderbolt story is the story of America's industrial triumph, the stubbornness of one immigrant engineer, and the courage of thousands who trusted their lives to a flying brute. It began as a joke. It ended as a legend. And even today, when you hear that deep, unmistakable radial growl at an air show, you're hearing the voice of a machine that once carried the weight of the free world. History is full of forgotten giants, machines that burned bright for a moment, then vanished as progress marched on. The P-47 Thunderbolt could have been one of them. Overshadowed by the glamorous P-51 Mustang, replaced by sleek jet fighters, dismissed by those who never knew the sound of its guns or the way it could tear the clouds apart. But the jug never really disappeared, because the men who flew it and the ground crews who kept it alive made sure it never would. When the war ended, thousands of Thunderbolts sat silent across Europe and the Pacific, lined up on airfields, wings drooping, engines still warm. Some were scrapped, melted down into aluminum for a new, peaceful America. But others survived, scattered across the world, finding new homes and new wars. France flew them over North Africa. Brazilian pilots flew them in Italy and later over the jungles of Latin America. In Yugoslavia, they patrolled the skies in the tense early years of the Cold War. Even as the jet age began to roar, the jug refused to die. But perhaps the truest legacy of the Thunderbolt isn't in the wars it fought. It's in what it represented. The P-47 was the ultimate expression of American engineering under pressure, built not in peace, but in panic. It was a machine born of necessity, of urgency, of fear, and of faith that something built by human hands could outlast chaos. When Alexander Kartveli designed it, he wasn't chasing beauty, he was building survival. And survival in war is everything. Kartveli would go on to design new aircraft, the F-84 Thunderjet, and later the mighty F-105 Thunderchief. Each of them carried echoes of the jug. Big engines, heavy frames, brutal speed. The lineage was unmistakable. Every time an American fighter thundered off a runway in the jet age, some part of that sound was still the jug. For the pilots, though, the jug was more than a machine. It was a companion, one that could take punishment and still bring them home. Many spoke about it the way you might speak about an old friend. One veteran, Colonel Francis Gabby Grabreski, America's top P-47 ace, once said, "The Thunderbolt saved my life more times than I can count. She could take more hits than any plane I ever flew and still keep flying. I loved that airplane." He wasn't alone. Hundreds of pilots shared stories of miraculous returns, of oil-soaked landings, of wings shredded by flak, of engines coughing smoke and fire while still refusing to quit. To them, the Jug was alive. In air shows today, when a restored Thunderbolt takes off, the crowd feels that same vibration, that same deep, throaty growl that once echoed over Europe and the Pacific. For a few seconds, time folds. The sound of 2,000 horsepower tearing through the air is more than nostalgia, it's memory made mechanical. And in that sound, you can almost hear the ghosts of the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's wolf pack, climbing into their cockpits again, grinning, nervous, ready to face the endless gray of German skies. You can hear the farmers in Normandy looking up as the Jug screamed overhead, clearing the way for liberation. You can hear the soldiers on a jungle beach in the Philippines cheering as a P-47 dives to hit an enemy convoy. That's the legacy, not just of metal and engines, but of presence. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew more than 746,000 sorties during World War II. It destroyed over 86,000 enemy vehicles, 9,000 locomotives, and 6,000 tanks. It dropped 132,000 tons of bombs, more than any other Allied fighter. And yet, for all its destruction, its story is strangely hopeful. Because what the Jug really represented was endurance. It was proof that the rough, the unrefined, the underestimated could outlast the elegant. That power and persistence could matter more than perfection. That's why people talk about it. That's why 80 decades later, historians still call it the monster that saved Europe. When you see one in a museum, gleaming silver, wings outstretched, it's easy to forget what it once was. A symbol of industrial might, yes, but also a shield, a lifeline for men who believed they'd never see home again. There's a quote carved on a memorial at Duxford Airfield in England, dedicated to the American airmen who never came back. It reads, "They gave their today for our tomorrow." Among them were Jug pilots, the stubborn few who flew through fire and smoke so others could live. And maybe that's the real legacy of the Thunderbolt. Not just that it was powerful, not just that it was indestructible, but that it kept showing up when everything else failed. In every sense of the word, it was relentless. And sometimes that's what wins wars. Today, only a handful of P-47s still fly. Each time one lifts off, it carries not just its weight, but the memory of an era. A time when courage and machinery fused into something unstoppable. When that radial engine growls across the sky, people still look up. And somewhere, deep inside, a voice whispers the same words that pilots said in 1944. "If you're in a Jug, you're coming home."